I think probably everybody in this room knows the story of the three little pigs. Yes? Okay. There's no one who's never heard that story, right? We all know what happens. There's three pigs. They each build a house. One built a house of straw. One built a house of sticks. One built a house of bricks. And then the big bad wolf comes, and he goes to the straw house, and he huffs and he puffs, and what happens? Blows the house down. That's right. And then they go to the second house, and the wolf is there, and he blows the stick house, and what happens? It falls down, right? So the first two pigs, they run to the third house, the house that the little pig made that was made of bricks. And when the wolf comes, he huffs, and he puffs, and he blows, and does the house fall down? No, it doesn't. That's right. He even tries to come down the chimney, and depending on which version of the story you read, either he gets burned to death or he singes his hind end and he runs away. So we all know this story. I think we even know what is the basic point of this story. Why did we hear this story growing up? Well, it's because, it's trying to teach us a lesson, right? If we act wisely, if we are prepared, then bad things aren't going to happen to us. The first two pigs, they weren't wise. They just kind of built these ramshackle houses, and then when trouble came, the wolf blew them down. But then the third pig, he was prepared, and so they go to his house. And the moral is just like, let's not be idiots, right? Build your house out of something that's going to stand. Be wise, be prepared. Now, what if I decided that I'm going to give you a TED Talk about the story of the three little pigs? But instead of focusing on that moral, instead of talking about being wise and prepared, what if I pointed out that actually I think the lesson we can learn from this story is that there's a value in community. And that's demonstrated by the way the three little pigs help each other out. If I pointed out their ability, that they helped each other when one of them was in trouble, the others came to their rescue. The third pig had a lot of compassion. He took in his unhoused pig neighbors. They shared a lot of camaraderie as they were gathered there in the brick house, and they were kind of gleeful that they got the wolf and he got away and everything was safe and they were good. They kind of had a bond in the midst of adversity. They had companionship as they stayed together in the brick house. They celebrated when they defeated the wolf. Even joy that the first two pigs had in the midst of the sorrow of losing their homes. Yes? Okay. You're probably saying, sure, okay. I don't really think that's the point of the story, but yeah, I can get what you're saying. I can maybe go with that. Maybe I can, take your illustration and see the rewards and benefits of living in community and joy of coming together to make something happen together. Great, sure, whatever, okay. Well, we've been looking at the book of Galatians now for several weeks, right? And today, in these last verses of chapter 4, Paul, the guy who wrote this letter, he's going to do something similar to that. He's going to take a familiar story with a commonly agreed upon lesson, and he's going to take it and he's going to turn it on its head a little bit to demonstrate a different point from this story that everybody knew. He's going to tell a story that everyone, all of his readers would have known, and use it to confirm a truth. And he's using this story to drive home the point that he's been moving towards for these last two chapters. Every Sunday, we have a big idea. Like, here's the thing that we want to remember as we look at this passage. And today's big idea is going to be a little bit more of a big statement with a big question. And here it is. Most of us have faith. But is our faith in ourselves, or is it in Jesus? Most of us have faith, but is that faith in ourselves, or is our faith in Jesus? Even if we say we don't believe in God, we don't need a faith practice, or even if we do have a belief system like Christianity that we adhere to, we have to ask ourselves, what is my faith actually in? Is it in myself and my ability to live up to something, to meet some code, some unwritten morality, some vague standard that involves me being better than other people? Or is my faith actually in Jesus? Do I really believe that his life and death and resurrection are enough to actually change my life, that he's everything that's needed? We have faith, but is that faith in ourselves or in Jesus? And I'd like you to just keep that thought in the back of your mind as we look at this passage today. Now, before we actually jump into Galatians, I'm going to give you some context by making sure that we understand the story that Paul is going to refer to. He's telling his friends in Galatia the story of Abraham, Sarah, Hagar, and then their sons, Ishmael and Isaac. Now, this story comes from the ancient history of Israel back in Genesis chapters 15 to 21. Abraham, in this story, is a pretty old guy. He's in his 80s, and he has an encounter with God. And God tells Abraham, Abraham, you are going to be the father of a new nation, the nation of Israel. God tells Abraham that he's going to have a son, and that his descendants will be as numerous as the stars. But, like I said, Abraham is old. He's in his 80s. His wife is old as well, and she feels bad that he's now gotten this message, and she's like, I can't have kids. I haven't been able to have kids. And so she makes a proposal. She says, hey, God said you're going to have children. I can't do it, so why don't you go over in the tent with my servant Hagar? She's younger, she's beautiful. You two can get together and do what people do when the romantic lyre music plays, and she'll get pregnant in my place, and then we'll have a son. And Abraham says, are you sure about this? And before she can even get confirmation out of her mouth, he's already in the tent with Hagar, and they're doing what they do. Hagar gets pregnant, she gives birth to a son, and they name this son Ishmael. As soon as Hagar gets pregnant, and then continuing on after the son is born, she starts bragging to Sarah about how she's better than her. And she's ridiculing Sarah because she can't have kids. And it makes Sarah feel like maybe Abraham doesn't really care for her, that he loves Hagar more because she was able to give him a son and Sarah couldn't. So there's a lot of drama and bad blood between Hagar and Sarah. Imagine that. Who could have predicted? So, Hagar has this son. She and Abraham name him Ishmael. And around the time of Ishmael's birth, God has a conversation with Abraham again. And he says, I told you I would give you a son. You have a wife, Sarah. She's the woman through whom I'm going to fulfill my promise to you. I know you're old. I know you're getting older. But Sarah is going to be the mother of the child I promised you. So sure enough, 13 years later, when Abraham is 99 years old, Sarah gets pregnant. And then when Abe is 100, Sarah gives birth to a boy. They name him Isaac. Isaac grows into a toddler and then a young child, and eventually, like brothers tend to do, Ishmael teases Isaac. He's kind of rough on him. He isn't always kind to Isaac. And that is when Sarah has had it. After stewing on this for all these years, living under this ridicule, and now she's watching Ishmael make fun of Isaac, Sarah goes to Abraham and gives him an ultimatum. It's her or me. You send her away, along with Ishmael, because I can't take any more of this. I am not putting up with her ridicule and shame, and I'm not letting my son put up with the same thing. And so Abraham says, okay. He sends Hagar and Ishmael off to live on their own. Ishmael becomes the father of what today we call the Arab people. Ishmael is the line that leads to Islam. And Isaac is the lineage of the Jewish people. He leads all the way to Jesus. Now, this is a very familiar story to everyone in Israel. This is the foundation. This is how Judaism started. This is the beginning of the nation of Israel. And the obvious point for the people of Israel is trust God. Trust his timing. Believe what he says. Don't take things into our own hands. Wait on God. Believe in the promises of God because God's trustworthy. And when we don't wait on him, there can be bad consequences. Consequences that affect us both in the short term and that can ripple down through generations. So it's this story, this foundational, familiar, deep-rooted history from the very birth of Israel. This is the story that Paul now takes, and instead of just bringing out the usual lesson, he's going to draw some new conclusions to help him point to the truth that he's been hammering and that we've been studying for the last several weeks. All right? Okay, so let's read together in chapter 4 of Galatians, verses 21 to 27. First, he asks them a question. Tell me, you who want to live under the law, do you know what the law actually says? The scriptures say that Abraham had two sons, one from his slave wife and one from his freeborn wife. The son of the slave wife was born in a human attempt to bring about the fulfillment of God's promise. But the son of the freeborn wife was born as God's own fulfillment of his promise. These two women serve as an illustration of God's two covenants. The first woman, Hagar, represents Mount Sinai, where people received the law that enslaved them. And now Jerusalem is just like Mount Sinai in Arabia because she and her children live in slavery to the law. But the other woman, Sarah, represents the heavenly Jerusalem. She's the free woman, and she's our mother. And as Isaiah said, "Rejoice, O childless woman, you who have never given birth. Break into a joyful shout, you who have never been in labor. For the desolate woman now has more children than the woman who lives with her husband." Okay, there's a few more verses, but we're going to pause here before we get to the last part of this passage. Paul starts off with that question. You want to live under the law. Do you know what the law actually says? Now he's using a double meaning here. Both times he uses the same Greek word for law, but each time he's using that word in a different way. He's saying, you want to live under the law. You want to rely on obedience to rules to make you right. But do you know what it says in the law? And here he means the law is in the first 5 books of the Bible, what the Jewish people called the Pentateuch. So for the Jews, the law was both the list of things they were meant to follow in order to keep the covenant with God, but the law was also the Pentateuch, as in a section of their sacred book, the law, the prophets, poetry, wisdom, okay? So Paul asks this question. You say you want to try and measure up to the law, to the rules, but are you aware of what the story in the law, the Pentateuch, has to say about that? You say you want to live by it, but do you actually understand what it's telling you? And he proceeds to remind them of this famous narrative of Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar. He says Abe had one son, Ishmael, from his slave Hagar, and one son, Isaac, from his free wife, Sarah. He highlights the point that everybody already knows from the story. Ishmael was born out of their attempt to help God keep his promise. Hey, God, I want to help you out. We're going to do this thing for you. But Isaac was the miraculous actual fulfillment of God's promise. And Paul reminds them, and he's reminding us too, that we need to believe God. Trust that what he says is true. Trust that God will do what he says in his time to bring about his good and our benefit. And then he throws this unexpected curveball. He first says that Hagar and Sarah represent 2 different covenants, 2 different ways of living within the promises of God. Okay, we think. Paul's been spending a lot of time in this letter to the Galatians talking about the law, about faith, about grace, about obedience. So it's going to make sense that he's going to talk about 2 different paths, living a life that tries to keep the rules to make us right, and living a life that places faith in Jesus to make us right. Now, I want you to think back to what we've looked at over the last 4 weeks. Think about our big ideas that we've talked about over the last 4 weeks. 4 weeks ago, we said, we're not going to try to earn what's already been freely given. Okay, that was 4 weeks ago. And then 3 weeks ago, the law was not given to secure the promise of God, but to point to it. And then 2 weeks ago, the best way to understand salvation is adoption, if we think of it as a family and that God has grafted us in. And then last week, following Jesus is a joyful transformational relationship. It's not a dreadful, superstitious checklist. We've been seeing over and over in these last few passages that obedience to the law can't save us, that it points us to Jesus, that we're not earning our place. We've been adopted into his family, and now we have this wonderful relationship with God. So, when Paul says there are 2 different covenants in verse 24, we go, yeah, right, we got it. And Paul says, do you? Do you got it? Because he goes on to say something that nobody, especially his Jewish listeners, would have expected. He says, Hagar, the partner who represents our own efforts, trying to help God out and do it our way. Hagar is just like Mount Sinai, where the law was first given. And that Jerusalem, the holy city, the place where the temple of God is, the place here on earth where the Jews believed the very presence of God dwells, that place, Jerusalem, is akin to Mount Sinai because just like Hagar, all of Jerusalem is enslaved. Not enslaved to a person like Hagar was, but enslaved to the law, enslaved to the effort, the striving, the work, the labor of trying to make ourselves right by what we do and what we don't do. Jerusalem, the very center of all Jewishness, is a slave, Paul says, just like Hagar was a slave. Now, I hope you can realize the shock that this would have been to the Galatian Christians. He's telling them that the place they think is the most holy place on earth is actually a picture of how enslaved we all are when we try to earn a relationship with God by keeping the law, doing the yes things and avoiding the no things. And then, to further confound them, Paul says, Sarah, who is the mother of all Israel, is not like earthly Jerusalem at all. Sarah, the mother of Judaism, is not representative of Jerusalem here on earth, the center of all Jewish belief and worship, but she is representative of the real Jerusalem, the very city of God where all creation will be restored and dwell together. Sarah, as the free partner, represents freedom. Freedom from striving to prove that we're worthy. Freedom from working to try and be good enough. Freedom from the guilt of knowing in our hearts that we actually don't measure up. Freedom from the shame that even though we try, too often we just don't do what we know is right. There's two paths here, two covenants. And if you try, if you say, I'm going to perform myself into God's family, Paul's saying you're actually just a slave. You're living by rules and standards that you know in your heart you can't meet. But if you believe that what Jesus offers is true, is real, then you're not a slave. You're a full heir to everything that God has to offer. The law leads to enslavement, faith leads to freedom. And then Paul quotes that verse from Isaiah 54. He says, Rejoice, O childless woman, you who have never given birth. Break into a joyful shout, you who have never been in labor. For the desolate woman now has more children than the woman who lives with her husband. This verse from Isaiah is from a time when Israel had been conquered in battle and they were living in captivity in Babylon. They were feeling hopeless, downtrodden, defeated. And then God sends his prophet Isaiah with this reminder to them, a reminder that's like a subtle flashback to Hagar and Sarah. God, through Isaiah, reminds them to rejoice in the midst of circumstances that make you feel like a childless woman. Rejoice, shout, because God is able to bring about the unexpected in your life in the same way he brought about the unexpected in the life of Sarah. And with this verse, Paul here is reminding all of us that the gospel of Jesus' grace is especially for the barren, the ones who feel inadequate, the ones who don't measure up, the ones who know they don't have it all together. The able ones, the fertile ones, think they can attain acceptance on their own, by their own efforts, by their own goodness. But the barren, the ones like Sarah, they know they need Jesus. Tim Keller puts it like this. He says, grace is not just for fruitful Hagars, but for barren Sarahs. If Sarah can have a future, anyone can. To paraphrase what you just read in Isaiah, the barren woman has more children than the fruitful woman. Why? Because she believed God. Did Sarah believe God perfectly? No. Not at all. But she had enough trust to believe that what God said was true, and God proved faithful in what he promised. So having made this unexpected point in the story with the story of Abraham and Sarah and Hagar, now Paul is going to talk about the two boys, Ishmael and Isaac, and make another connection for us. So in verse 28, he says this, "And you, dear brothers and sisters, are children of the promise, just like Isaac. But you're now being persecuted by those who want you to keep the law, just as Ishmael, the child born by human effort, persecuted Isaac, the child born by the power of the Spirit." Well, what do the scriptures say about that? "Get rid of the slave and her son, for the son of the slave woman will not share the inheritance with the free woman's son." So, dear brothers and sisters, we're not children of the slave woman, we are children of the free woman. Now, we get a little deep in the weeds here as we try to decipher what all of this means. But remember, for Paul's Galatian listeners, this would be very familiar. As familiar to them as the story of the three little pigs was for you. He's saying, we as Christians, as followers of Jesus, we are children of the promise. We are spiritual Isaac. We're descendants from the child of faith. We're not from the child of human effort. But from the very beginning, there was strife between Ishmael and Isaac. There was tension, there was competition, and Ishmael, the older brother, did what older brothers tend to do. He ridiculed his baby brother. And we're reminded here that the slave children, the children of the law, the children of human effort, always have and always will continue to persecute the children of faith, the ones who live in the grace of Jesus. This is a really astute observation on the part of Paul. As Christians, we tend to wail and moan about how the world is against us, we're wrong, we're the lone voices of moral sanity in a world gone mad, society's pursuing pleasure at all costs, and we're getting ridiculed because we believe in an absolute truth. But here, we see Paul saying, really, it's the law abiders, the ones who think that by keeping the law, by living up to a certain standard, the ones who work to prove themselves worthy, those are the ones who persecute the children who live by faith. They try to squeeze out those of us who unabashedly trust in only the grace of Jesus to make us acceptable to God. The ones who live as if their rule obedience is going to make them more worthy of a seat at the table of God, they ridicule those of us who believe that God's grace is enough, that all that's necessary is what Jesus did to give us a seat at the family table with God. So, how do we respond to this? Well, Paul, in what I think is kind of a clever twist on a very unspiritual moment in Sarah's life, he uses her words to show us how to respond to those who challenge us to let our behavior make us worthy. Sarah, when she was angry and frustrated in her fierce but misguided protection of her son Isaac, she told Abraham to cast out Hagar and Ishmael. That's what Paul's quoting when he quotes that in the last part of that passage. Now, was that the kind thing for Sarah to do? Was that a grace-filled action she took? No, it wasn't. Especially since this whole fiasco was Sarah's idea in the first place, right? It's really disingenuous that now she's mad and she's going to take it out on Hagar and Ishmael. But that's what happened. So Paul takes that harsh, unloving rebuke and he uses it to show us how we should respond to anyone who says that it's our behavior, our actions, our keeping of special days, or keeping a ritual or an ordinance, that those things are going to make us right with God. If anyone says that Jesus, his life, death on a cross, and resurrection from the dead is not all that's necessary for us to be adopted into God's family, he says, cast them out. Get rid of them. Don't go down that path. Don't believe for a minute that you need Jesus plus something. Jesus plus going to church 3 times a month. Jesus plus serving at your local food pantry. Jesus plus 3 pairs a day and 10-minute devotion in the morning. Jesus is enough. If what he did by dying on a cross and then proving that even death was not powerful enough to defeat him, if that's not enough, why did he do it? We are not children of the slave woman, relying on obedience to rules to make us right before God. We are children of the free woman. We know we're barren. We have nothing to offer God to make us right. But we believe because of Jesus, we are made right. And we trust him in what he said. So what does this mean for us in very practical terms? Do we just live however we want and say, thanks, Jesus? Sure appreciate and sure I'm glad I'm adopted in the family of God forever. I'm going to go do whatever I want now. Thanks for making that possible. So there's 4 ways that we can live this out. I've got a little diagram I'm going to put up here. If we think of the law, then when we come down from the law, we can there's law obedience and there's law reliance. Law obedience means I'm either going to try to obey what God has said or I'm going to not obey what God said. And then there's law reliance. I'm going to rely on that obedience to make me worthy, to make God accept me, or I'm not going to rely on it. I'm not going to believe that doing those things is going to make me acceptable to God. So once we realize that there's these 2 options when it comes to obedience to the law, and there's 2 options when it comes to reliance on the law, then that leads to 4 different ways that we can respond if we combine those 4 boxes. Okay? So we can have 4 perspectives about ourselves and God. So first, we can be law-obeying and law-relying. We can say, I'm going to do my best to obey all the rules, and I'm going to believe that that's going to make me righteous. I'm going to rely on my obedience to the law to make me acceptable to God. When we choose to obey the rules, and we believe that obeying those rules will make us worthy to be accepted by God, we quickly become self-righteous. We become confident in our own abilities, and we present to others as very confident or even arrogant. But inwardly, we feel insecurity because we know, even if nobody else sees it, we know we aren't perfect. We know we're not keeping all of the rules. We know we don't measure up, and then that can lead to frustration. Why can't I do better? Why isn't this working? I should be improving. I should be achieving my best self. So while outwardly we project competence and self-worth, inwardly we experience self-doubt and confusion and frustration. Or worse, we delude ourselves into actually believing our own press clippings. We believe I'm as good as others think I am, or as much as I present to others. All of that is not going to lead us anywhere good. So next, we can also be law disobeying. I'm not going to keep the rules, but we're still believing that relying on the law is what makes us worthy. Now, that's a very confusing place to be, right? I believe that if I do these things, that's going to make me right with God, but I'm not doing them. So when we do this, we believe that achieving worth through works, it's possible, it's achievable, but I can't actually do it. It might be because of past failures and it just makes me want to give up. Addictions that seem impossible to break. Relational patterns that feel so embedded in us we just can't get free of them. And the results can sometimes be a little bit positive. We have a kind of form of humility because we can see clearly that we're a mess, and that leads us to some tolerance for other people who are a mess, and we feel empathy because we're right there with them. But there's also a lot of guilt. It's hard to believe that I should earn my place in God's family, but never be able to earn my place. That's exhausting, and it's defeating. So then third, we can still disobey the law, but we can also say, I don't care, I'm not relying on the law. I don't think it's going to make me better, so I'm not going to obey it. Those of us who live with this outlook, we're not really putting God into the equation at all. We don't need to obey some code written by God. We don't need to count on some arbitrary system to make us feel good about ourselves. But typically what happens is we still live by some sort of moral law that we construct for ourselves. Like, I'm good by my own constructed standards, and I'm certainly better than you. And whether I acknowledge or not, I'm holding you to that unwritten code, and so I feel superior because I know what the code is, and I know I'm living up to it, and you're not. So this can be expressed as hedonism, like I'm just going to live my own truth, or on the other extreme, compassionate altruism. I live a life that serves others and fosters a world I want to live in. But in the end, even though there's no objective standard that we obey or rely on, there is a standard that we create for ourselves. And we rely on ourselves to live up to it, and we expect others to live up to it as well. So there's frustration in that at the same time. Last, we can choose to obey the law, but not rely on it to make us worthy or righteous. When we live with this mindset, we're realizing, okay, Jesus has done it all. His life, death, resurrection has provided everything necessary to make us right with God, to reconcile us to him, to adopt us into his family. We can trust Jesus completely and then live our lives based on our position as an adopted, loved child, an heir, resting securely, glad to obey him out of love and affection and gratitude. We don't obey because obedience makes us acceptable, or that earns us God's favor or makes us get better blessings. We obey because we're grateful. We're in a relationship with our Father, and when we sense he's calling us to something different, to a new way of living or a new way of thinking, we think, I can trust him, and if this is something he wants for me, it's probably worth doing. I think I'm going to pursue this. So we got these four ways of thinking, four perspectives about our relationship with God, with the law. And I'm going to bring us back to our big idea. Most of us have faith, but is our faith in ourselves or is it in Jesus? And this big idea today, it's really kind of a push. It's a prompt to get us to stop for a minute and to really think about where is our faith? Usually we end the messages with an action step, a way to go from knowing to doing, belief to action. But today, instead of an action step, I'm going to ask you to do this. I'm going to ask you to take some time for a belief and action examination. Today, this week, sometime soon, before this leaves your mind, think about those four ways of approaching life. They're written there on the back of your card. And then just be honest with yourself. Where am I at on relying on the law, doing the right thing, not doing the wrong thing, to make me right before God? Where am I at when it comes to actually obeying what God sets before me, and what do I think that accomplishes? As we think through these four perspectives, we have to be honest. And we have to also acknowledge that we're probably not exclusively in one of those all the time. We can tend towards one perspective on our best days and another on our worst days, or maybe have one perspective depending on what is going on in our lives or what part of our life we're looking at, and something else in a different time in our life. But there's probably one that resonated with you as we went through those today, one that you thought, yeah, I get that. I see that I'm thinking that way. In this passage, we're challenged to trust only in Jesus. We're asked to actually believe that Jesus' life, death, and resurrection is everything that's needed to make us right with God. And then to live a life that responds to that. To live out the grace we've experienced so other people can see what life is like to live in the freedom of God's family. If we live a life that communicates to others that both they and we are made new by our behavior, we're misleading them. We're misleading ourselves. God doesn't ask us to get fixed, to be an able, fruitful example of the best of humanity, and then come join his family. No. He takes us in, barren as we are, and says, welcome home. Let's discover a new way of being human together. So think about which of those four you most tend toward, and then also think about, how do I move toward becoming a person who trusts only Jesus, not my behavior, but also rests in the love of Jesus so much that I choose to follow where he leads because I know I can trust him. Law obeying, not law relying. So I'm going to end today with the two questions. The first one is the one that Paul asked at the beginning of the passage, and the second one is our big idea. If you think you want to live relying on your own ability to be good, do you understand what that actually requires? Is that really the weight you want to carry? We all have faith of some sort. Is your faith ultimately in yourself, or is it in Jesus where it needs to rest? Let's pray. Father, it's good to look at this. I've liked studying it. I've liked digging in and seeing what you're communicating to us and the things that you're challenging us towards. And I am also so aware and convicted that that's not where I live all the time, and that I slide into believing I'm going to earn your love or your favor. Set me free from that. Set all of us free. Remind us to rest. To rest in you and in your grace and mercy. To really believe that because of what you did, Jesus, it's enough. We're made right with God, and we can bask in that love and acceptance and then move forward. And when we don't, when we're looking to something else, when we believe that what you have isn't good for us, or we believe that I need to just be better so that you love me more, just show us, remind us of your goodness, your compassion, and your graciousness towards us, and then teach us to just drop those things and turn to you instead. Thank you. Thank you that you're never giving up on us, that you're never shaking your head, but you're constantly coming and just saying, I'm here, I'm yours, I'm your Father, and I have good in store for you. Teach us to listen. And we pray it in the name of Jesus.